some time talking about Damascus and relating those things to the stories we have here in Acts chapter 8 and 9. Excuse me. So, without further ado, let's kind of jump into that. Acts chapter 8, we're told the story of the God. This is not correct. Oh, it is correct. All right, so I just did more review than I thought I did. All right, so we're told the story of the gospel as it comes to Samaria. And we, of course, as we mentioned on Wednesday, the people receive it with joy. You've got the story of Simon trying to purchase the apostles' gift and be able to distribute that gift to other people. And then it jumps straight into the next story of Philip, which is Philip basically being led by the Holy Spirit to just go to a place. The way it reads is kind of almost seems a bit miraculous. An angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, "Get up, go south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza." It's a desert road. So he got up and he went. This would not have been close. It would not have been a probably an easy trip, but he does it. What's interesting to me is that instruction would have been odd. If you want to go and share the message with people, where do you not go? The desert. That's not the place you go. When the Holy Spirit says go to the desert and you've just had wild success in a city and in a region, now go to the desert. Okay, so he does. He gets there. They see a chariot. And of course, we know the story, right? Somebody tell me the story of the Philip with the Ethiopian treasure. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to the assumption. But yeah, I mean, and we love this story. I mean, it is really a great story of how the gospel works. You get in front of somebody who is asking questions, who wants answers, who is looking for something, and you share with them the gospel message that has those answers in it, they respond. And it really is just a great picture of how the gospel is supposed to work. And all of us want to be Philip and have this kind of experience, right? Where you just show up, meet a stranger, you have a conversation with him, he wants to be baptized, he rejoices and goes on his way, and then you're zip up out of there to somewhere else. I mean, it really is a great. I love the story. Like I have a hard time not getting excited about this particular story. So, but to better understand the story, we need to kind of have an understanding of what the Ethiopian was dealing with. So, he is, as it says here in the text, there was an Ethiopian man, a eunuch and high official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopian, who was in charge of her entire, or he was in charge of her entire treasury, and he has gone to Jerusalem in order to worship, which lets us know about him. What do we learn about the Ethiopian from this story? Do what? Okay, proselyte, yeah. So he is either, I mean, maybe he is a Jew living in a foreign land. That's one possibility. Or he is a foreigner who has converted to Judaism. He's a proselyte. But he is clearly somebody who is involved in Judaism one way or another. Yes? Do you have your finger? It's not true, but no. Yeah, I mean, we do know, I mean, part of what we know about Judaism by the time you get to the first century is that there are pockets of Jews in many places. That was part of, they're called the dispersion, right? That's why you've got Jews that are living in the east, you've got Jews that are living in the north, the south, and Africa, and all these different places. So it is not a foreign concept to have displaced Jews if that's what we're dealing with. It's also possible, though, that this is an African man, an Ethiopian man. He is an Ethiopian. That doesn't not necessarily mean he is a born Ethiopian as much as it is a man from Ethiopia. So it doesn't mean he's necessarily from African descent, but it might. I mean, that leaves open that possibility. And so you've got I like to think probably a foreigner who is responsive to the law, responsive to God, and he is coming to Jerusalem to worship. Yes, sir. Yeah, so just north of Ethiopia, you've got a large Jewish community, and that makes sense, right? How often is it that the Jews, whenever they needed help, where did they run? Egypt. We see that Old Testament and New Testament. And when Joseph and Mary needed a place to hide from Herod, where did they go? Egypt. I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons you've got such a large community there. And that community started back during the Old Testament time. During the divided kingdom, there were multiple occasions where people moved on to Egypt. And God warned them not to, but they would anyway. And so you've got those episodes. I don't know which it is for this man. Is he an Ethiopian of Ethiopian descent, or is he a Jew that is living in Ethiopia? We're not told. What we're told is he's an Ethiopian, and he has come to Jerusalem to worship. So he's from there, and he's coming to Jerusalem to worship. So we learn that about him. What else do we learn about him from this little sentence? Do what? He's responsible. So he clearly is a man of trustworthy character, right? He is in charge of the treasury of the queen. That's what we know. I think, also going along with that, you've got the fact that he is a slave. So he's not a free man who is just there hired to do a job. He is a slave in the queen's household who is doing a job. And so there's a little bit of a difference there in the way things are handled. You also have, and I did not realize this, that Candace is not actually the woman's name. It reads that way in our text. That's the way it's often translated. There is no Queen Candace in Ethiopia. The queen, the word for Candace, I actually went back and looked at the Greek, and what you have are 3 titles in a row. And one of them is transliterated as something like Candace. Well, we're used to the name Candace, so just translate it Candace, okay? That was actually the title of the regent woman or the regent queen or the woman in charge, the royal woman. And that was a fairly common thing for about, I think, 700 years in Ethiopia. They had established the authority of a queen, and a queen could, in Ethiopia, and this is very different than Egypt, because Egypt would not allow this, but in Ethiopia, a woman could rule, and she could rule at the side of a man, or she could rule instead of a man, but a woman had as much authority in their royal culture in Ethiopia as a man did. And that's a fairly unique characteristic of Ethiopia at this time period, wouldn't you imagine? Not very many countries would allow that. So it's interesting that the Bible includes this story about a woman ruler, when a woman ruler would have been a somewhat unique thing. If this was being fabricated, you don't put a woman ruler on the throne. But in Ethiopia, you can. If you go back and look at the reign of the queens and you look at their time period, you come across these 2 women that I bolded there for you. Amanitore and Amanitiateri, probably pronouncing those horribly wrong, but those are the two that are sometimes talked about as being this Candace, this queen of Ethiopia that is mentioned here in Acts chapter 8. And so what we know about these two women isn't much. They would have ruled in a city called Meroe. There were 3 different capitals through Ethiopia's history, and in the last part of their history, at this time period, you have Meroe, that is the capital city. And so that city flourished, or really the country flourished from 750 to 350 AD, but at this point, Meroe would have been the capital city. It is legendary for its incredible wealth. So the idea that this man is the chief treasurer of the queen of Ethiopia meant he was in charge of not just a small little bit of, well, they're a nice little country over there. They were a well-established, very wealthy country at this time period. And so particularly the first one we're going to talk about in just a moment, that was their wealthiest period of history. And if this is the treasure of her house, this is a pretty remarkable amount of wealth he is handling. Ethiopia grew rich from ironworks, from trade, because of where they're placed there on the Nile River. They basically handled all the trade that was coming into Egypt or out of Egypt, and they had a lot of commerce because of that. They were also very wealthy in grain. Like they were a predominant food source for many of the places in Africa. And so they made a ton of money with that. I also found that interesting because what is it that made Egypt so wealthy back at the end of the book of Genesis? Grain. That, they were able to control the grain pretty much for the world at that point because of the massive drought that came up that Joseph oversaw. It's interesting here, now we've got this Ethiopian who is in charge of the wealth of Ethiopia, which means he's probably also in charge of the grain. He's kind of a Joseph character here, a lot of similarities there. So also, just for an interesting side note, just because I love war stuff, you've got the Kooshite Archers are renowned for their incredible skill. And so one of the things that Ethiopia did was they came and helped Rome win a few battles. And probably what they did was they sent their archers. Their archers were just, accurate, pretty incredible legends about their archers. Scott? They were hireable. So I don't know that they were allies of Rome as much as they were, they didn't mind hiring out their skills. So I don't know that they would have jumped at the behest of Rome unless it benefited them in some way. So I didn't see anything in there. Looking at their history, there are times when they helped Rome. There are also times when they fought against Rome. So I don't think that there was necessarily an allegiance to Rome as much as it was they did what was in their benefit. So, all right. So yes, Ron. No. Yeah. So this is, I think, it's been a while since I looked at a map of modern day Africa, but I think Ethiopia is somewhat removed from Egypt in our modern day. At this point, Kush would have been pretty much the region from the south border of Egypt all the way down, almost halfway down the continent of Africa. It was a much larger territory that has at this point been subdivided. But it was a pretty impressive amount of territory and a pretty impressive kingdom at the time. Amanitore, who was the first queen, Candace, possibility, she reigned from just before the time of Jesus to not quite to the end of Jesus' life. So the odds that she is the Candace mentioned here is very unlikely. And the reason I say even likely at all is it is potential based on the language that he is a treasurer who served this queen, but might not have still been serving. He's just the treasurer of Queen Candace. But she is the queen of the most prosperous period of Ethiopia's existence. She is the one who was responsible for rebuilding the temple of Amun. Anybody know who Amun is? Or Amun? It's an Egyptian god. Okay, so she gave a lot of attention to Egyptian gods and Egyptian theology and religion. She is also remembered as being a bit of a warrior queen. She conquered several of their enemies and expanded the borders and did all those types of things that you like for queens to do. The reason I think some people like to refer to her more than the one who came after her, which is more likely the Queen Candace that's mentioned in Acts chapter 8, is because we just don't know anything about the queen that would have lived at the time that this story in the book of Acts happened. Some have suggested that maybe she was Jewish and that he was Jewish also, and so he was doing her bidding, taking her sacrifice to the temple, that sort of thing. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, not in the Bible or secularly. It's just wishful thinking of some people. There's really not anything known about her other than she just carried on the reign of the previous queen. I couldn't even find if there was a family connection there. So that's how little we know about this particular queen. But things remained affluent during her reign. There wasn't really a decline in Ethiopia. But I found this quote from Smithsonian Magazine that says, in the dusty highlands of northern Ethiopia, a team of archaeologists recently uncovered the oldest known Christian church in sub-Saharan Africa, a find that sheds new light on one of the old world's most enigmatic kingdoms and its surprisingly early conversion to Christianity. An international assemblage of scientists discovered the church 30 miles northeast of Aksum, the capital of the Aksumite kingdom, a trading empire that emerged in the 1st century AD and would go on to dominate most of Eastern Africa and Western Arabia. Through the radiocarbon dating artifacts uncovered at the church, the researchers concluded that the structure was built in the 4th century AD, about the same time when the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, and then converted on his deathbed in 337 AD. The team detailed their findings in a paper published today in Antiquity. The discovery of this is a little bit later in the article. The discovery of the church and its contents confirm Ethiopian tradition that Christianity arrived at an early date in an area nearly 3,000 miles from Rome. The find suggests that the new religion spread quickly through long-distance trading networks that linked the Mediterranean via the Red Sea with Africa and South Asia, shedding fresh light on the significant era about which historians know little. So here's what I want you to note about this. First of all, yes, it is interesting that Christianity showed up in abundance very, very quickly upon the legalization of Christianity. Okay, that is, I just find interesting. Maybe you don't, but I do. Secondly, I want you to notice and this is a tangent of sort, but I want you to notice the bias of the writer of these findings. Okay, notice here where did it mention here? It is interesting to them that the church could appear so quickly 3,000 miles from Rome. Why are they concerned about Rome here? The church is centered in Rome, right? I mean, if you're looking at it from a Catholic Church perspective, yes, it is interesting that 3,000 miles away, immediately upon the founding of the legalization of Christianity, that a church in abundance could pop up. unless there's a more likely scenario that the church has actually been there all along, that it didn't come from Rome, and that once it became legal, they were allowed to all of a sudden be more public and open about the fact that they were Christians, and so now we see it popping up all over the place. Doesn't that make a little more sense from a historical perspective? If you're not having to explain everything being sourced from Rome, this becomes a really easy explanation. Okay, Dallas? Yes. So this is very accurate that their tradition, that it came from Jerusalem from this trade route. Yeah. Yes. I mean, and that's where, again, it's kind of interesting to see how it all pieces together. The likely scenario is, and this goes back to what was said earlier, Chris talking about, we like to think that the Ethiopians stayed faithful and grew the church there in Ethiopia. Probably so. You look at it from the perspective of, as soon as Christianity became legal, now Christianity is in abundance in this region. Well, the odds are that it really didn't come from legalization. It was something that had come illegally, something that had come covertly, and had grown in the underground for many, many years. And all of that started, or at least a start of many starts, was the Ethiopian that Philip taught. I say that way because there's no reason to think that the Ethiopian was the sole Christian who ever showed up in Ethiopia with the gospel, and he had to grow all of it all by himself. No, Christians went all over the place, right? And so there's no reason why there couldn't have been others show up to help along with that. So while the story does not take place in Ethiopia, what I want us to recognize and kind of let it hit home a little bit, that this treasurer who is receiving the gospel while traveling from Jerusalem back to Ethiopia, he was facing off with an ancient pagan religion. We know that Ethiopia was extremely steeped in worship of Amun and worship of Nut. Nut was or Newt. I like to say Newt because that sounds a lot better than Nut. Who wants to worship Nut? But you've got Newt there, who is the goddess of the sky. She literally is the sky. If you ever see Egyptian hieroglyphic depictions of her, it is a woman that is basically doing downward-facing dog yoga pose over the earth. Like that she is the sky itself. And so they would worship the sky in the form of Newt. Again, I don't know that Newt's any better. So the treasurer also had at best probably a small Jewish community. There was a Jewish community, but it would not have been like Jerusalem, right? Most of the Jewish communities we read about in different places would have been small. There was one in Egypt. There probably was a small one there in Ethiopia. We don't know how large it was. But here you've got he's going back to adversity. He's going back to a small Jewish, so the one place where he had comfort from a religious perspective, he's losing by turning to Jesus, or he has to teach them, which is what I think he probably did. He likely has no Christian community going back at this point. As far as we know, the first time we read of the church really dispersing in mass is at the beginning of chapter 8, and we're not even done with chapter 8 yet. So how far has that Christian community spread? Probably not very far. And so the treasurer seems to have done some teaching I would think, for Christianity to spread as well as it did by the time of Constantine. But other than that, we really don't. All we have is hopeful wishes that he did well, because we're not told the rest of his story. He's one of those people that you're probably like me of, it'll be interesting to meet him in heaven one day, we hope, and say, all right, give me the lowdown. How did all this go? Like, so many stories I want to hear that I probably won't ever hear, because at that point they're going to be like, does it really matter? Like, let's move on and worship God. Like, that, yeah, we don't want to dwell in the past. So But I would love to know more about the story itself. And so, let me go back to the map here. So here, I don't know how well y'all can see it, but here we've got Jerusalem here. Ethiopia is way down here, right? I mean, you kind of have to skirt around the Red Sea and then get down and walk through Egypt and get down to Meroe, which I can't remember where in Ethiopia Meroe is, but you're way down here. And so that somewhere along that road, you've got Philip teaching this guy. Now, the road itself that Philip ended up on was between Jerusalem and Gaza. So pretty close up here, you've got the teaching going on. When the story is over, it's interesting. Verse 39, when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him any longer, but went on his way rejoicing. Philip appeared. So at this point, he didn't travel to, he showed up at Azotus. Okay? Azotus is over here, right there. And we know that he taught along the way as he went between Azotus up to Caesarea. And so you've got him, again, we don't know all the stories that happened. I would imagine there were many more interesting ones, but he is whisked away some way. He shows up in Azotus, gets his bearing, and travels up to Caesarea. And so, and of course, I love that end piece. While he was traveling, preaching the gospel in all the towns until he came to Caesarea. So everywhere he went, he taught. I love that. I love that is the way the early Christians functioned. Especially when I look at myself and I look at us in the modern day church and go, we can't even teach staying in the same place. Yet here they are traveling and stopping everywhere they go, living on the grace and provisions of God, and teaching everywhere they go. Everybody they can come across, they're willing to teach them. There's a lesson in that for us. You know, how much of that are we willing to do? So, yes, David. Yeah. 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 And again, we don't know how much, he clearly was wealthy to have a scroll of Isaiah, even a partial scroll of Isaiah. And he's able to go back and share that with his community, which I'm guessing would be the other Jews in his community, and it spreads from there. It's amazing to me how well the early church did that. Here's the scripture. Let me explain to you what this means. Now we know, and they're able to convince people that this is what Isaiah is talking about. Lisa? Yeah. And I think that's why some people think that maybe the queen herself was Jewish, because where does, first of all, a slave get educated? Second of all, where does a slave get that kind of money to be able to purchase documents? So maybe the documents, the scrolls belong to the queen, or he was getting them for the queen, or those kind of things. Again, that's all subject. I mean, that's all assumption. There's really no way of knowing any of that. What we do know is here's a man who was, I think, probably perfectly set up to do the job of taking the gospel back to Ethiopia. And you got to know God had a hand in that. I mean, here is a man who is educated, wealthy, in a high position. He's able to bring scrolls back from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. I'm guessing, again, it's conjecture. He bought it in Jerusalem, and he's trying to figure it out on his way home. We don't know. He might have brought it with him. But here you've got a man who is set up to be able to deliver the gospel. And God very much has a hand in that. Any other thoughts, questions on the Acts 8 stories? No. All right, so we move on to Tarsus then. Again, Tarsus is kind of the other direction. It is up on the north side. If I go back to the map, here you've got, well, it's not on that map. I'll show you a different map in a moment. It's located in ancient Cilicia, that's modern-day Turkey. This is north of Israel. You kind of go north and go around to the left of the Mediterranean Sea, and right there, a little bit north of there, is Tarsus. And so it had a fairly long history and involvement with Rome. That's why Tarsus is a somewhat special place, and why, again, the fact that God chose Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, has some providential elements to it, just like we see with the Ethiopian treasurer. Rome's involvement in the Misradatic wars, basically Misradates hired Cilician pirates to come and plunder Rome and to cause trouble and to basically shut down their Mediterranean vessels and their ports and those types of things. And before Pompey comes along, Rome basically tried to handle all of that from land and couldn't ever defeat the pirates, because the pirates would come in, cause trouble, jump back on their ships, and go back into the sea. And then as soon as the soldiers cleared out, they come in, they plunder, they jump back into ships, and go back to the sea. Very much like Pirates of the Caribbean movie. So yeah, that's kind of that's what's in my head. I know that's not what they look like, but it's what's in my head whenever I hear stories about pirates. So Pompey the Great is commissioned by Rome to basically go in there and solve the problem. And so what he does is he basically takes a fleet of ships and goes out into the Mediterranean Sea and defeats them the proper way with cannons and war. No, not really. But they go out in the ships and they basically stop the ships, because that's how the pirates are able to do what they're going to do. And basically they take all the pirates captive or kill them, and they enslave them or they ship them off, and they basically make them farmers and laborers in different regions. They kind of split them all up and spread them out so that they're not able to cause trouble anymore. Well, Pompey does a great job with that. So after that, Pompey and Pompey's in charge, and Julius Caesar is rising, but Julius Caesar, is so impressed with Tarsus as a city that he starts giving it special treatment and special promises. And of course, Tarsus, which is a powerful city and very wealthy city because of where it's placed on trade route, puts their support behind the man who's giving them all the free stuff, right? That's the way this goes. You support the one who gives you free stuff. And so they love Julius Caesar. They actually even renamed their city Juliitis or something like that. That sounds like a disease. But they name it after the Julius part of Julius Caesar at one point. It doesn't stick. It's still called Tarsus. But he gave it tax-exempt status. He gave it a bunch of other benefits. Not only that, but this was about the time that the Jews started jumping in and helping Julius Caesar and trying to put their support behind Julius Caesar, because he gives them freedoms. He's the one who guarantees them that he will give them freedom of religion, and he will leave them alone, and he will, a lot of those benefits we talked about when we talked about Jerusalem, a lot of those came commissioned by Julius Caesar. That's why the Jews supported him and not Pompey in this big civil war that was happening in Rome. So if you want to place Tarsus, here you got Israel, this tiny little section that we always blow up real big on maps, and in our heads it's really big, but it's actually really tiny. Tarsus is up here. It's not far away, but it is up there, and it is removed from Israel somewhat. So again, Saul, the man, growing up in Tarsus, would have had a lot of benefits from that. He was born there, which meant he was given the benefit, because of where he was born, of being a Roman citizen, even though he is Jewish. And that is huge. There were not many Jews who had that privilege. And so you see that coming to bear in his actual ministry, several times when he is beaten, when he appeals to Caesar, which is his right as a Roman. Even traditionally, he is not killed as a slave or killed as an enemy of the state. He is given a Roman's death traditionally because of his governmental status as being born in Tarsus. This actually even comes into play later in the book of Acts, where he gets into a discussion with a centurion. Remember that? And he says, well, I am born Roman. And the centurion's answer is, well, I had to purchase my Roman citizenship, and that was a much lesser degree Roman than being born Roman. And so all of this, again, comes into that. Also, probably Saul would have grown up wealthy. I base that off of two things. One is he's born in Tarsus, and it was a wealthy city. It was a place where it was the country club city. Like, it was where you go to be wealthy. Secondly, he is able to go live in Jerusalem and study under the teacher of teachers. Well, you had to support yourself to do that. And so the fact that he could go be a student of Gamaliel meant he came with certain financial benefits. And so he's got this preferred status as a Jew. He's got a preferred status as a Roman citizen. He's wealthy. He's an up-and-comer. You've got all these good things going for Saul, which part of what leads him down the wrong road, but also what helps him once he chooses Jesus. We'll come back and talk about that. He would have been familiar with a lot of I would imagine, a lot of the cultural practices that were taking place in Tarsus. One is there was a cult of Hercules that was pretty prominent there. You've all heard of Hercules, right? Or at least seen the Disney movie. Very historically accurate, of course. And you've got this great we'll come out and talk about that. There's Zooestrianism, which still exists today, interestingly, but it's another very prominent religion in that region. You've got the cult of Cybele, you've got Manichaeism, and the cult of Isis. And the reason people like to point these things out is because, for instance, the cult of Hercules has a man who dies and resurrects to save his people. And the cult of Isis was the Egyptian god who died every year and came back every year. And so you've got a lot of emphasis in Tarsus on resurrection, on the coming back from the dead. That was a very normalized idea among the Romans in that region. That's not true everywhere. It depends on which cults of religion exist in your particular region as to how accepting you are of certain ideas. And so some like to argue that Saul's familiarity with those cult practices is what shaped his teachings of the gospel. I would argue no. The gospel is the gospel. Truth is truth. I would be willing to say that his approach to talking to Romans about the gospel could have been shaped by what he was familiar with, what they already believed and knew, because of that whole being all things to all people. He didn't change the truth, but it could have influenced the way he talked about the truth in order to make it more understandable or more acceptable to the people he was talking to. And so his familiarity with resurrection concepts within the Roman culture would have possibly, at least, influenced the way he talked about the gospel and shared the gospel with other people. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there? Don't misunderstand me. I am not saying he believed what he believed because of Roman practices. If anything, that probably stood in the way of him accepting the resurrection, is because he would have been so against the concepts of resurrection based on his being against Roman religion. He was a Jew. The Romans believe in resurrection, not us. So if anything, I kind of wonder if that didn't in some ways impact the fact that he was not willing to accept Christianity while he, quote, kicked against the goads. Okay? But you do have him in the way that he talks about resurrection. For instance, when you get over to Acts chapter 17, and you've got that sermon he delivers on Mars Hill, and he talks about resurrection, and some of the people want to hear more, and some of the people ridicule him because he mentions resurrection and those sorts of things. I do think that probably greatly impacted the way he did talk about the truth of resurrection as we see in the story of Jesus. Chris? Yes? Yes, but not in the same terms that you would think of talking about the similarities of what you see between the story of Jesus and the cult of Hercules or Isis and those types of things. The Pharisees believed in life after death. I don't know that they believed necessarily in the way the gospel presents resurrection. So they were willing to believe in life after death. They were willing to believe in a heavenly realm. They were willing to believe in angels. The Sadducees didn't believe in those three things. But the way he talks about resurrection is definitely powerful to those who would have walked through the cult of Hercules and Isis and those types of things. And so I think that influenced it. All right. So here, I'm not sure why I put this back up there. I'll tell you in a minute. Oh, so for Damascus. So again, I point all of that out because I think it's interesting to look at Paul from the culture he would have grown up in, both on the way it impeded his ability to accept the gospel message and also in the way that it probably aided him in delivering the gospel message. There's some lessons in that for us. Okay? We are going to have a hard time reaching our culture if we remove ourselves from it so thoroughly that we're not able to relate to people anymore. And I know there are some who try to do that. They try to so remove themselves from culture. I don't know that that's wise. We have to be cautious that we are not being influenced by culture. We need to be cautious about letting culture shape who we are. But that doesn't mean that we need to so far remove ourselves that we can no longer relate to people. And Paul very much used his cultural background in order to reach people that needed to be reached with the gospel. Does that make sense? And I'll use this as an example. My brother was really big, and I think I've told y'all this before. My brother was really big into D&D and gaming and game shops and all of that sort of thing when he was growing up. And my parents hated it. Like even tried to argue the whole games of the devil argument type things with him. Do you know how many people he has led to the gospel through game shops? He's not going and sinning. He's not going out and getting drunk. He's not doing bad things. But because he is able to reach people who normally are pushed to the side by the average American middle class person, he is able to reach people and have conversations with people because he takes a background he has and uses it as an opening door with different people. And that's important, that we be able to do that sort of thing. And that's what I think you see Paul doing here with his background. All right, so we've got the story here in Acts chapter 9 of him heading to Damascus. Damascus is an interesting city because it is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in all of Earth's history. It's just been there forever. Okay, it was part of, you have Roman or Egyptian influences, and you can basically trace nearly every world power through the archaeological digs and such that have happened in Damascus. You see the evidence of them being influenced just from the beginning. And so that in and of itself makes Damascus somewhat interesting. There's also a lot of pride that goes along with that. We are the city that has survived everything. Like that, there's a certain amount of pride that goes with that. Another thing you find about Damascus, I did not realize this, that it had a massive court or temple to Jupiter in it. And Jupiter is the Roman version of Zeus. Kind of help you put that together. Zeus, for some reason, we're very familiar with the Greek names of these gods and not the Roman names. So what do we know about Zeus? Probably because of Rick Riordan and Percy Jackson stories. But what do we know about Zeus? The big God, right? Like he's the main God. He is the head God. He is the God you go to when you need pretty much anything that the other gods can't do for you. That's his temple. He had temples in several different cities. His largest temple is in Rome, as you would expect, but one of his largest temples is here in Damascus. What's also interesting about it is, and this is the part that I didn't realize, that the inner court of the temple of Jupiter had been complete for quite a while, but during the whole story of the New Testament, it was under construction, being expanded. It was being enlarged. They were building not an outer court around the inner court where you actually gave your worship to Jupiter. The outer court was essentially a city center. It was the marketplace. It was where you could go, pretty much where you went for anything. So Damascus centered around, both from a location basis, but also from a cultural community basis, it centered around the temple of Jupiter. And that, you better believe that had an impact on the way things happened in Damascus. If everything is centered around the worship and the giving homage to this particular God, that would have been a big part of what they dealt with there. There's also, though, a lot of evidence of very early Christianity in Damascus. And that should not be shocking to us because of the way we've watched the church expand out of Jerusalem. Damascus isn't really that far from Jerusalem. It's essentially right on the other side of Samaria. It's before you even get to Antioch. It's between those Jerusalem and Antioch. And so you've got a fairly large community of Christianity that settled in Damascus very early. And that's especially true, again, whenever you see Christianity legalized in the 300s. Immediately, the church there was massive. Because before it was legalized, guess what? The church there was massive, just people didn't know as much about it, right? But they kind of kept hidden. And so that is a big part of what you have here in Damascus. Now, some think they've even found, you can go tour Ananias' house. I don't know that it's really Ananias. That's the thing with a lot of the special locations over there in the Middle East. They find something that they think, oh, this is fancy. It must be something in the Bible, because everything in the Bible has to be fancy. For instance, apparently Ananias' house was literally underground. He lived underground. It was a massive room that is a church. It wasn't a church when Ananias lived there, but it has become a church over the years, because wouldn't you want to worship where the man who baptized Paul worshiped and lived? And so you've got this underground, literally underground church that meets in Ananias' literal underground house. There's really no way of knowing whether this is or isn't. The same people often will assume that Ananias is an elder, a leader of the church. That's why God chose him to come and be the one to you have to have Saint Ananias to baptize Saint Paul before he became Saint Paul, because important people help important people, right? Not necessarily. But again, I find it interesting that, and again, Dallas has been there and he can tell you more about this, but just how specialized certain places become over the years because of tradition, because we want to have a place to identify and mark. This is the place where that important thing happened. And what we love to have those physical representations of things. So that's essentially what you're dealing with here. We'll talk more about Saul on Wednesday. So, all right, thank you.